Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next episode from the empty waiting room, Emergence, Models of Strategy and Practice. Well, Nick, this one sounds really interesting. What are we talking about today?
Thanks, Steve. This episode covers our modern management phenomena of wanting certainty in all we do, rather than to accept that much of the future shape of services has to be, in my view, emergent. In other words, arising in a probabilistic and iterative way based on common shared values, principles, and aspirations, rather than hopeful, pre-designed, and target-driven blueprints. And I'm going to explore that idea in conversation with two people again, with Catherine Kevis, coach and ex-chief executive of organisations working with people who have complex social needs, in which I explore how we link the beginning threads of a strategy to our end operational models in a way that requires us to start with the outcomes and behaviours we're seeking and allows the models of practice to emerge. And I'm also going to talk to my colleague, who I've done a lot of work with, and graphic artist Jon Ralphs. And John's going to talk about why storytelling is such a powerful tool in managing in the present moment, as it pulls you into a process that links past and future through what the indigenous Mãori call the concept of Whakapapa. It continues the theme from the last episode that you can't force a future into being, you have to let solutions emerge.
Great stuff. Well, I hope everybody enjoys this episode. Thanks very much. Okay, welcome everybody to the next episode of the empty waiting room with Nick Day, and this one is about emergence, models of strategy and practice. So what does that mean then, Nick? What are we talking about today?
Well, anyway, welcome to you all to this episode of my podcast based on my recent book about title of the empty waiting room, and the subtitle is about working with people who have complex social needs. So that's the kind of overall topic. The book is based on my lifetime's work and research, and it's a manifesto for change that argues for a different, more radical way of delivering public services, one that's customer and citizen focused and more relevant to their needs, to what they want. And I also argue in the book that it's cheaper than top-down hierarchical way of delivering services. So kind of very apposite in terms of the current economic climate. And in this episode, what I want to do is explore how we link the beginning threads of a strategy to our end operational models and goals. In other words, how we best allow solutions to emerge based on a set of principles and values, rather than dictate in advance a detailed plan of the end state. So it's in this episode, it's about talking about linking past and future, because as the poet T.S. Eliot said, in thy beginning is thy end. So that's a very important principle for me. We get it right at the beginning. There's a much better chance that we get the end outcomes that we're all seeking. So joining me today in today's conversation are Catherine Kevis, who I've known for many years and she'll introduce herself in a minute, but certainly who's an ex-CEO who's had experience of this dilemma of linking the beginning and the end and working within a public sector context. And Jon Ralphs, who's a graphic artist I've worked with over a number of years recently in creating strategy and practice through storytelling. It's a very important way, I think, for me of getting this beginning, this end strategy. And Jon very, very kindly, with his great skill, illustrated my book. So welcome to you both. Thank you for joining me. So maybe as a starter, I could ask you perhaps, Catherine, just to introduce yourself in a bit more detail, and then Jon to do the same. So, Catherine.
Yes, hello. Thanks for having me. Just to say, I lost you for 30 seconds or so. I don't know if it's at my end. It may well be my connection. So, I'm Catherine Kevis. I worked for a number of years in housing, primarily supported housing, where I served as a manager and then a director in a housing association here locally in Worcestershire. I also have been director and CEO of charities, including working for a community foundation, which is a grant-making body. I actually stopped my last job as CEO of a local charity last year to retrain, and I retrained as an executive coach, qualified in November. So I'm currently developing my business, which is two-pronged really. One is as a charity consultant, and the other is as an executive coach, working one-on-one with executives, directors, or CEOs.
Thank you, Catherine. Jon.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me, Nick. It was interesting when you talked about in your introduction. I was doodling. Hey, is that allowed? I don't know, but I doodled a spiral. And you know, the great thing about a spiral is that it's going forward and going back at the same time. And I think my my kind of life journey really is a journey of going backwards and forwards at the same time. So my dream when I was young was to be a famous painter. What I realized when I met my wife is most famous painters are dead. So she said, get a proper career. So I went into nursing. So interestingly, as I get this spiral of being creative, using my kind of clinical, local authority, health kind of stuff, as this kind of just flow. And I think now I probably draw more than I train or do anything else, you know. So I get a sense of this kind of spiral. So I use words, pictures, and colours to help people with their thinking, to help organisations with their strategy, or help individuals move towards a better life. So that's me in a nutshell.
Jon, that's great. Thank you. And I think you and I have seen the power of that, haven't we, in working with a number of clients in terms of how story opens up a whole range of conversations that probably wouldn't have been opened up any other way, and capturing it in picture. And perhaps we'll come on and talk. Well, I'd like you to talk a bit more about that as we get into the podcast, because I think it's a really important dimension to creating strategy and practice both now and in the future. So I think what I'd like to do by way of starting, Catherine, is to ask you, from your experience of working with people who have complex needs, how have you encouraged local solutions to emerge rather than kind of dictate what comes into being, and to trying to translate government directives or commission or objectives into something you know will work in practice? So I just wonder whether you just reflect from your experience on struggling with that tension.
Yes, it's a challenging question, and one which hasn't got a single answer. I think also it's a team effort. So for me, it comes with understanding where we're placed really when delivering services with people with complex needs, who quite often have experienced something in the past, childhood trauma, for example. So there is a narrative which we quite often are not aware of when we meet the person that we want to support. And that can also be true, of course, of the commissioners who have commissioned the service that we're providing. I mean, it's been my sort of the mission for my work generally, and charities that I've worked in and in housing as well, have been largely influenced and funded by public sector bodies, be they local authorities, probation, or PCCs, police and crime commissioners. I think there's different perspectives here, and from my experience, there are things we can do, first of all, to connect with a person we're supporting and take a person-centered and holistic approach, using tools such as the Wheel of Life, for example, which looks at people's kind of experience on different dimensions. And that, of course, can be different to the commission. So, for example, if we provide a service for women experiencing domestic violence, we might want in their Wheel of Life to understand where they're coming from, how they've experienced it, how the relationship developed, which is not in the commission from a local authority or a police and crime commissioner. So I think the way we do that, bringing the local and the outcomes-based commissioning, is actually bringing that depth of understanding of an issue. And that requires some level of research and understanding, and also increasingly lived experience. So the experience of service users helping to serve the service users of the future, so that we can get better at what we do in terms of a support, and ultimately sort of reduce the impact of these issues or stop them altogether. So the co-production is one way of doing that, working with people we're supporting, and actually bringing their voice to the procurement process where it exists. Working with other agencies also in the field, and our peers. And I think in terms of the commissions, they need to build in more flexible sort of funding mechanisms and capacity building. So there is that ongoing, there is some headroom for learning and learning together. So it becomes a circular process of co-production, learning and improvement.
That really is a lovely kind of, I think you capture the situation, Catherine, as I see it in the book. You've captured that really succinctly and well, and just started to pick out the different perspectives that you as a provider might have and understand, because you're working with the people receiving the service, and the way the commissioner might look at something and kind of what they ask and demand. And perhaps you started to highlight some of the ways we might overcome those challenges, and we'll perhaps come back to that. But certainly from what you were saying, I'm sure that has echoes, Jon, with the way I could see you nodding, and has echoes with the way that you approach your work, and so on, some of the issues, some of the dilemmas that you face. So do you want to pick up the theme that Catherine has raised?
Yeah, I just made a kind of note about what stories do people tell themselves, and I think when we've worked together, Nick, the stories that commissioners say is you'll never sit in a room for an hour with young people, and we sat in a room with young people for an hour and a half, sharing their story. So I think there's something there about when we have a safe space. When people are paying good attention, you pick that up from me as well, and we're kind of present, and we are our authentic selves. I don't try to be young and trendy. I just who I am, and I think people appreciate that. The people that we've worked with, and I think also just I think the first time we worked together, Nick, we worked with a group of people that experienced homelessness, and you can tell a story about their lives, can't you? And actually not see them as people first. And I remember when I was doing I do a big graphic, probably about 3 meters long, and as people talk, I'm drawing. And one guy just politely said, "Excuse me, do you mind me just saying something?" I said, "No, what's that?" He said, "You spelt that word wrong." And I thought, and his background was his mum and dad were teaching, and he was very well educated. And he just unfortunately found himself in a place of being homeless. But he was my here and now spell checker, which was a great strength to bring to that session as well. So I think for me, it's seeing it's people. It doesn't matter who they are, whether they're a commissioner heading up a multi-million-pound organisation or whether they're somebody that's experienced homelessness. I think it's always, for me, it's people first. I'm always thinking, hey, that sounds like a Brené Brown quote, but I'm always thinking about connecting with that relationship with people first.
Don't you also find that everybody wants to tell their story if they're given permission to do that? Because that's usually like that meeting you're talking about. Don't be in the same meeting. You can't be in the meeting of young people for an hour. You'll never do it. Well, you will if you're listening, and if you've given them permission to tell their story, and you will if you've not imposed, this is the story we're going to tell today, which tends to be the dialogue that comes through and goes, we want you to discuss this today we're telling you, and we're going to lead you down the story that you're going to tell. Well, no, because that's not their story. That's the story you want them to tell. That's different, isn't it? So it's completely
very true. I often see a lot of consultations where they've already got a prefixed agenda, and this is what they want, and this is the outcome that a service or an organisation wants. They don't give that space or time, And to be fair, when we just had 3 very simple questions, a very loose, semi-structured interview. Nick's great with numbers, but we did loads of young people. I try and think, how many young people did we work with, Nick? I'm thinking 50 plus.
The contract you're thinking about, John, it was 50 plus young people.
Yeah, absolutely. And every young person contributed, and they told some really difficult stories about being removed from their family situation, feeling really scared about going into a young person's home. But we just I think you're right, Steve, just allowing that space and not interfering too much with that story. And the only thing that Nick and myself did at the end was just, can we just check that we've got it right, And we used the drawing that I did. So what you said was, and we got that. And then maybe listening to what good support looks like, just simply that. And then again, giving people space and time to hear that. And then something a little bit aspirational, which I'm very keen for. So, if your life was good, what would you want to see in your life, in the future? And those 3 simple things actually collecting that information supported the sufficiency strategy in one local authority, which was great. But its roots were from young people sharing their stories.
Yeah. And I think just building on that point, John, what was really good about the whole experience was that the commissioners were quite prepared to listen to that story, weren't they? Mm-hmm. And they actually, in that particular case, I think we distilled we distilled the conversations into 3 or 4 principles, didn't we?
Yeah.
But the important bit was that was a reiteration as well, because we used some young people to do it and check it, didn't we? We didn't. Yeah. It wasn't just you and I, John, saying, well, this is what we've heard. Now we'll interpret it our way. The interpretation itself was done with the young people directly in front of the commissioner, who then said, that's absolutely brilliant. What we'll do is those 3 or 4 principles, we will now embed that will be the core of our strategy for the next 3 years. And to be fair to them, they took that at the core. I mean, that was a really good example, I think, of the commissioner starting from a point of view of wanting to hear and being willing to use us as intermediaries in that to get that story and create strategy. Because I think, to use your phrase, Catherine, it did create that headroom, I think was the phrase you used, for learning. And I think that's something that, do you want to say a bit more about that, Catherine?
Oh. Actually, the thread I was picking up here is the co-production. Yeah. So this triangular co-production where you act as facilitator for the commissioner and the young people in this case. And I think also, just to add to that, there needs to be the right conditions or terrain, if you like. The ground needs to be right in order for this to happen. It doesn't just magic out, does it? And I think so that comes with that sort of being able to suspend preconceptions that we all come with, or being aware of our own biases as well, because it's difficult to be non-judgmental, but at least to have an awareness of any biases that may exist in order to allow people to bring their authentic self into the conversation. And of course, it begins with the self and how we present to the world.
Yeah, all this the social care space as well is always difficult stories when you're dealing with these things. So none of these are easy stories to tell. So to give people those space, that's massively important, surely. So domestic violence, homelessness, whatever those things are, they all come from a position of really difficult positions, you know, for them to tell a story. So you've got, and surely they've got to hear those voices. There will be a theme that goes through a lot of that stuff, you know, where there's disconnects. But if you don't know and you haven't asked the questions of the people who are actually experiencing it, how are you ever really going to know? Like I said, you come in with preconceptions and bias. That's never going to work, is it?
And that's why we always ask open questions, Steve, in the process, because you don't quite know what you're going to get, but that's fine. And I think it's having the confidence as a facilitator, as a practitioner, to work with the uncertainty that's going to be thrown at you, rather than try and actually make everything certain before you start. And I think that's often, for me, you find many practitioners I come across, many commissioners, are not prepared to work with uncertainty and probability. And I think it's you'll know, Steve, that is a theme in the book. Yeah. Having the skill to work with that. I think the other point from what Jon and Catherine were saying is there's a whole chapter in my book devoted to what I call the receptive context. That's a bit of a jargon word for actually saying creating part of a task in the change and transformation process is working out the best type of space to have that conversation. Where are people, you know, for example, going back to Jon's story, it was important where we met the young people. So Jon, I think we used youth centres, we used places that young people were comfortable in. Yeah. It's the same with homeless people. It's meeting them on their territory, and then they feel safer in telling that story. And so I think that is it's not just saying, right, well, issue a questionnaire or we'll, get them into the office. It doesn't work that way. You've just got to find the right place to have that conversation. I can see you nodding, Catherine, as
yes, I think the place is right, and the questions that you ask as well are quite key here, because people don't just come as a problem. No. So what I'm saying here is getting away from a label of homelessness or young person. Yes. They will also come with a rich experience which is other than the problem itself that we're trying to solve, and it's about tapping into these resources and this experience which actually enriches the conversation both for the practitioner, the commissioner, and the person themselves.
Yeah.
So actually they come out of it feeling like they've made their contribution rather than being a recipient of a
Yes.
service, if you
Yes.
like. So I think it says something about power, I think, and equity as well. So it is about meeting people, you know, where they're at. If we're talking about
Yes.
place, both sort of emotionally and physically.
And
doesn't
I think
that also support the fact that you've made an effort to do that as well? Because if you're just dragging them into your office and that's how you're doing it, it's on them to come to you, not for you to go to them. And that's massively psychologically different.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, because you've made the effort. We want to listen to you. And surely that's a different message than I'll come and say something if you want to. You know,
I think one of sorry, Steve.
Oh, go on.
I think one of the things that, I mean, John will know particularly because we've done a lot of work together, is in the initial conversations we have with anybody who commissions us, we work very hard at making sure they understand our desire to create that receptive context, that say, and why, and the effort you need to put into that, because John and I will know and have known. In fact, we withdrew from one piece of work with a commissioner last year because we weren't confident that we would have that receptive context, that safe space in which to. So we knew we would be ineffective. It wouldn't gain anything. And, you know, I think it was an issue we brought up on Friday with Ben, was this issue of brave leadership that you need in the process. You know, you need to take risks in saying, as we do to commissioners, actually, you need to approach it this way if you want this sort of outcome. In the same way that you need brave leadership in running an organisation to create the tactical operational approach that will give you your results. So it's been a big focus, I think, of what John and I have always done to create that space.
Well, it makes a very sustainable model, though, doesn't it? Because then the service is going to be sustained because you're serving people properly in the way that they need the outcomes rather than the imposed outcomes that are from the top. So, you know, you get much more value for money, which is what we're all after as well at this time. You know, political climate, right?
And in the book, Catherine and John will know that I've often used this concept that I discovered through New Zealand rugby called Whakapapa. It's the Mãori concept of linking the beginning and the ends. And actually, it came out of a book that asked, why was the New Zealand rugby team the most consistently successful rugby team in the world? Doesn't mean they don't lose matches, but actually they link very carefully their planning at the beginning with the way they allow a match to develop, and they put all their effort into giving people on the field, the players, the authority to run and lead that game, rather than say, got to work by this plan. It's a much more open, a much more to try and allow them to be but it's a disciplined way. They don't say, well, you do whatever you want on the field, but actually you work out you're giving people authority to work out strategies. They may have thought about them before. That's why they were getting such good end results, and they still do. Okay, why? And I think that was if you read any of the books around how do you win, they'll often quote this concept. So that's why I think this conversation is really important. It just doesn't happen. You have to link the whole it's a whole system approach. Which is, you know, something that I focus on in the book. You can't talk about this in isolation to the whole system. John, anything else you want to add about linking the beginning and ends and creating this right story?
Well, like I said, I made a couple of notes, and I think you alluded to it, Nick. I think for me, if we're talking about co-production, it's about checking back. And so often we use the word co-production to say we've ticked that box, we've consulted with, we haven't co-produced or co-designed. And I think my experience was that when we did and we got these ideas, what the stories were telling us, that we went back to young people and saying, have we got it right? And it got a bit shaped. And then we said, okay, so can we measure those principles? So we went away again. We went back again to say, hey, is these measurements right? And I think one young person picked up the booklet and then just dropped it on the floor like it was a load of rubbish, you know. And so we thought, hang on a sec, let's explore why that doesn't work, you know. And they said, actually, it's a checklist isn't going to work with young people. It's about conversation. So we might have that framework, but for us as youth ambassadors, we need to have conversations with young people. So always coming back, checking back on co-production. My other memory, a real powerful time, and I wrote the word brave down as well as we were talking. I remember we did some work with care experienced parents. So young ladies who had their babies removed because they were in care, and the trauma and the emotion that we heard from those set of stories. But I think there was some real bravery when we shared our kind of learning from that on two sides. We had some young women standing up and explaining their stories to probably, I don't know, 80 people from health and education and social care. This is my story. This is what happened to me. But I think also the brave bit was the person that commissioned that day was allowing or creating the space for those people to share their story as well. So I think there is something about bravery, and you know, sometimes we get so busy that in our kind of metrics that we get kind of box ourselves in to change. You know, we're so busy kind of checking things that we don't actually look up and actually to listen to. I remember those stories were so powerful. Just young mums sharing their experiences, and I don't want this to happen to the next generation of mums coming through that have been through the care system. Real power. And I love that bravery from both sides, you know, from the commissioners, but also from the young mums as well.
Catherine, do you want to develop that theme at all in terms of your experience in work and in actually working as a CEO as well?
Yes, I think something you said, Nick, resonated in terms of the self-organization of systems. From personal experience, it's not something that you can legislate. So legislate is the wrong word, but you just impose and say, right, as of today, everyone will self-organize, and it doesn't happen like that. And it can also lead to people misunderstanding what it means in the context of an organization. You know, it doesn't mean a free-for-all.
No.
And it doesn't mean that you're doing away with managers. It's something that I encountered in my last role, where people say, oh, you know, so we're all going to be redundant. And this is when the work actually begins. It's once you declare, and it does take some courage to do so, but once you declare you want to move towards a self-organized system, it's actually working with others to make it happen, because not everyone's understanding will be at the same level. We sort of move forward, step back, forward again, and then back again. And then, of course, that's internally within the organization. The challenge is also then to convince or sort of work at the speed of commissioners if you are receiving money from the public sector. Because again, that could be quite a scary concept to commissioners who are, especially even more so now, who themselves have the pressure to deliver on a set number of KPIs, which don't always equate to what people need. And I'll give you an example of that. We had a contract which was to work with prison leavers who were in need of accommodation upon leaving. and we could only work with them for a 6-week period. So for somebody who's been in prison, who has generally other issues to deal with, which get them into a place where their mental health is not as good as it should be, in order to find the energy to deal with their issues, you've got 6 weeks to deal with them and find them some sort of accommodation or get them on the list. And this is not sustained, this cannot be sustainable if you find a solution. And I think perversely you might meet that KPI, but that could be a very expensive way of doing it, because that person is likely to come back into the system.
Yes.
Because the system fails them effectively. And that becomes a bit of a, it creates conflict, I think, for a lot of charitable organizations set up to help people, so for the right reasons, but who then become conflicted over the fact that they're in a market, and the market talks about customers, and they have to think about who is the customer here. Well, the customer clearly is not the end user of the service. The customer is the commissioner, and their needs can be very different.
Yeah, well, I've experienced that. My wife works in child law, and they imposed a time limit for cases. So if somebody's kids get taken into care, there's a limit this case can go on for, and you understand it from the child's perspective. So a certain amount of time, if this goes on for years, then that child is a lot of their life and in not quite knowing what's going on. But the time limit is now so short that they don't have any time to access any change mechanism for the parent who might be struggling, might have drug addiction or any of those things, to kind of go, look, I'm on the straight and narrow now, I can argue the case to keep my children and all that type of stuff. And that whole process is now so short that they can't then make those effective changes to demonstrate to the court that they're now fit parents to take on the kid. So of course that then is a knock-on effect, because then they've got to be taken into care, and the amount of cost of somebody being taken into care is huge. So that saving in one regard is absolutely massive knock-on somewhere else.
Yes.
It doesn't work because you've imposed this hard deadline of something that's doesn't work in the human world. We're humans, and you're dealing
Absolutely.
with humanness.
And it's making human people fit into a system which potentially is not working in a humane way.
That's right, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think this beautifully illustrates the point that metrics create conflict and cost. They don't reduce them because of the way they're set up and done. Yeah. So it's probably worth now just perhaps drawing some of these threads together, and really asking both of you, Catherine and Jon, whether you've got any kind of concluding thoughts, having had this conversation, anything you want to add, anything you think we've missed and just needs to be noted and developed. Jon, do you want to try and put your concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Margaret Wheatley says the answer is the community. What's your question? And so often we in services we try to work really hard. Well, actually, the solution isn't just about those metrics or what we have to do. I remember as a community nurse, busting caseload, and my manager said, "Who's got space?" And I thought, nobody's got any space for another case. So when you think that through, so do you want me to drop somebody off my caseload that I haven't quite finished yet? Is it the person that's shouting loudest gets the space? What? And we didn't really kind of step back and saying, what's that about? And so for me, more and more, I think about what can the person do for themselves? So often we think about power and control, but what can the person do for themselves? What can family and friends do? Support them as well, because we have a different relationship. It's not a paid relationship. What can the community do, our neighbourhoods and our communities do as well? And then finally, what support is needed from the paid sector, from commissioners and from providers as well. So more and more, I talk to people with the complex needs about their super strengths, rather than they've got ADHD or autism or mental health needs. I said, that is a super strength. It's how you use that. So I'm more and more thinking about a strength-based, relationship-based approach to what I do. It's just great that I can pick up some pens and a big bit of paper and help with that conversation as I go along. But I think the principles are the same. If I was still back nursing, I think now I'd be, what can you do for yourselves, rather than creating a dependency on me as a clinician to support that person. Actually, I'm trying to do myself out of a job so that person can sustain that kind of development. That's my kind of reflection.
Jon, that's lovely. Catherine.
I so agree, Jon. And I think it's about building upon what's good, being able to articulate it and show what it looks like, what good looks like. And I think with regards to organizations and the relationship with commissioners, for example, or of the public sector or funders, it's to be able to co-produce performance indicators as well, which are both quantitative, because you do need to quantify what's good, and you can do that, and qualitative as well. So there are examples to illustrate what the data is telling you. And also I think it is about a cultural aspect, which is around flexibility, around change. And I think that's where your book comes in, Nick, in terms of describing what self-organization, what systems look like, and what leadership as well looks like. It's about understanding that the complexity around systems and actually human life as well, and not being too rigid with it. It's about having stuff that can permeate these boundaries and adapt, flex, and keep on moving. And that's where PIs are useful, to make sure you stay on track with the intended mission.
Yeah. What's been great about this conversation for me is that it's developed, both echoes some of the themes we talked about on Friday, when we kind of looked at the overarching themes in the book, and has brought out certain issues that came out on Friday, but it's also added a great richness around this conversation for me of how you link beginning and end. Some of the it's added some practical. We got into some practical discussion about how you do it if you're brave enough to do it. So thank you both for agreeing to take part in this, and it's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. So hope you have too. And it's felt very natural. It's felt like a good conversation to have. So, Steve, anything you want to say?
No, I think for looking at from the outside in, as I kind of do on these things, it kind of makes sense. I think it's just really engaging the humans in this process, and that's where we seem to fail all the time, because we don't speak to anybody, and that's what's really been covered in this stuff. So, hopefully everybody's found that really useful and a good starting point. Go buy the book.
Well, I'm talking to people that have, so I'm very lucky there. But anyway, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Jon. And
thank you.
See you again soon, no doubt, in some form, someplace, somewhere.
Is that right? Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you all. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, today, in summary, we talked about how story, rather than numbers, opens up a range of conversations that won't actually, and gives us information that probably won't arise in any other way. Because we need to acknowledge that we're not really aware of any narrative when we start supporting an individual or working with commissioners, and we really have to story allows you to start with their voice and get some engagement. We talked about the need for more flexible funding mechanisms to promote learning and development, and not define in advance, if you like, the way the story is going to be told. And Catherine used the lovely phrase, creating a headroom for learning. And that's what our funding mechanisms need to do, because often the skill that is not really clearly acknowledged often is that the skill is learning how to handle the chaos and uncertainty in front of you. So that needs what I've called in the book a receptive context, the right territory for the conversation to occur. So it has to be a learning territory, a place where people feel they can share and develop their own ideas, because people don't come just with problems, they come with experiences and they come with strengths, and story is a good way of acknowledging it. And we covered the concept that I use. Well, it's not my concept in the book, but I draw it from Mãori culture, and it's that concept of Whakapapa that the New Zealand rugby team use, which is how you link the beginning and end, the kind of continuous threads. So it's about how commissioning and delivery are linked as a single thread, and not really they're not a set of targets. So it's a way of actually learning how to work out strategy and operation in real time, not in a fixed way, but actually actively with people that are involved in the services they received. And finally, that self-organisation, if we use that term, which we talked about in the last episode, it allows us not to legislate and get boxed in, because metrics themselves often create conflict and waste in the way they're set up. So it's getting to the point in public services where we're asking, what can a person do for themselves?
Let's go over again what our takeaways are for this episode.